panel presentation, Understanding the Impacts of a Changing Cannabis Policy. Thanks for sharing your afternoon with us. I'm Tawnie Logan, the Executive Director of the Sonoma County Growers Alliance. To my right, Ernie Carpenter, who's a former Board of Supervisor, and Tawnie Silvaggio, who is a professor up at Humboldt State, environmental sociology, also engaged in a lot of good environmental work. So I think the best way for us to get going on this is to lay a little bit of a foundation for people who are really trying to understand the full perspective of why this conversation is at the table for a Sustainable Enterprise Conference. And I'd love to hand that over to Ernie to talk about the history of cannabis.
Thank you very much. Perhaps talking about cannabis is old hat. A lot of people left the room, but I'm going to wake you up and give you a little history. So I'm going to take a little historical approach to marijuana. I know this is about sustainability. To me, sustainability is three legs. I'm going to speak to the social justice aspect and how marijuana has been unjust through time. My father spent 32 years in the United States Navy, and he smoked marijuana, maybe you should just say pot, along with other sailors before it became illegal. The period was the mid-1930s. Marijuana law became regressive in 1937, promoted by Henry J. Anslinger, who was the first chair of the Bureau of Narcotics. He was the first hardliner on both drugs and alcohol under President Hoover. Around 1930, the government began a campaign against marijuana. Let me read you some titles that appeared in articles. Youth Gone Loco, Marijuana, Assassin of Youth, Uncle Sam Fights a New Drug Menace, Marijuana, Sex-Crazing Drug Menace, The Menace of Marijuana, and Exposing the Marijuana Drug Evil in Swing Music. Most of these authors drew their information from the files of the newly created Bureau of Narcotics just before Anslinger prepared his assault on Capitol Hill, that is, to get the first bad marijuana laws in the country. One more quote, and this is bloody. The sprawled body of a young girl lay crushed on the sidewalk the other day after a plunge from the fifth story of a Chicago apartment house. Everyone called it suicide, but actually it was murder. The killer was narcotic, known to Americans as marijuana, and history as hashish. It is a narcotic used in the form of cigarettes, comparatively new to the United States, and dangerous as a coiled rattlesnake. This is the very foundation of the drug laws in this country. Anslinger was given a boost when it was discovered there was probable collusion between drug narcotics agents and drug distributors. Can you imagine that? This is way back in the 30s. Skipping forward to 1992, we had the Boggs Act, which ushered in the undercover age, targeting such seedy characters as musicians. Here's what you got for a first-time possession of marijuana: 2 to 10 years plus $20,000 fine. Jump to Richard Nixon, 1971 of Watergate fame. Nixon used drug policy to go after liberals and minorities to disenfranchise their voting ability. Quote, "Look, we understood we couldn't make it illegal to be young or poor or black in the United States, but we could criminalize their common pleasure. We understood that drugs were not the health problem we were making them out to be, but it was such a perfect issue that we couldn't resist it." This is new information that just came out of the files due to the Freedom of Information Act. And that was John Ehrlichman, who was White House counsel to the president. The chief of staff, Haldeman, said, Nixon emphasized that you have to face the facts that the whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to. So they authored The War on Drugs and the Southern Strategy to Disenfranchise Voters Through Regressive Marijuana Law. It included no-knock warrants and mandatory sentencing. Prior to this, you might be interesting to know, they picked on the Mexicans a whole lot because they were the purveyors of marijuana, and in fact, it's noted throughout that they were the people who gave the swing musicians the marijuana. Terrible. During the late 1960s, the famous counterculture popularized marijuana in the Haight-Ashbury and even here in Sonoma County. The communes and longhairs were growing and using marijuana. Many of the local sons and daughters started smoking pot, and that brought about some real changes in local attitudes. This kind of thing happened across the country, and frankly, it drove Nixon crazy. President Reagan held that 100 marijuana plants were deemed the same as 100 grams of heroin. During Reagan's term, the number of people behind bars for nonviolent drug law offenses increased from 50,000 in 1980 to over 400,000 by 1997. During the 1980s was a repeal of mandatory sentencing, and marijuana was being differentiated from other hard drugs in the Comprehensive Drug Act Prevention and Control Act. From 1965 until 75, jumping back a little bit in time, returning veterans from the Vietnam War spread marijuana use from Maine to San Diego and Seattle to Florida. Yes, the Deep South saw marijuana invade every corner. Returning vets accounted for more changes in attitude and the spread of marijuana than any other single factor to impact the spread of marijuana throughout this culture. 1989, we had Bush's war on drugs. Even though nearly a dozen states had decriminalized marijuana, Bush went back to the familiar terms. I came in as a student in 1961, college that is, and here's what I saw. And this is the theme of my talk, if there is one. Brown, black, yellow, poor white, poor people singled out, picked upon by law enforcement. Arrests, sentencing, and the aftermath fell upon these populations. It's the same today, but in much fewer numbers. That is, fewer people are getting arrested, but roughly in the same proportion. The ACLU estimated $3.6 billion per year as the cost of what they call our national obsession with marijuana, New York Times, April 2014. They point out that after 3 decades of enforcement, about 30 million Americans used marijuana, that blacks and whites use marijuana in about the same proportion, but that blacks are from 9 to 30% more likely to be arrested, depending upon where you are. Sentencing is even more of a disparity. Come 1996, and we might say was from bad drug policy to the birth of an industry here in California. I'm running out, so here's what I'm going to do. It will take continuing people's revolution to bring about change, primarily at the ballot box. This is what happened in California, Oregon, and Washington. You cannot count upon your local politicians because they lack the wherewithal to create good, equitable drug policy. They run scared of public opinion. As an industry, you must educate the local people. You must stand up to bad law, and it will remain the same if you don't. The black, the brown, the yellow, the youth, and the poor will all be victims of this prosecution. The tendency is for government to overtax and overregulate. Speak out against this. It would be helpful to know the value of marijuana. Lastly, it's important to maintain representatives to government, like Tawnie, Logan, and Sarah Schrader, to communicate the message and to stay organized. We're only halfway home until marijuana is totally decriminalized. We will suffer the same problems of differential enforcement, and we will see the poor, the brown, and the black go to prison while most other people who can afford good lawyers skate. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Ernie, for that history. Really appreciate it. My name's Tawnie Silvaggio. Perfect. Just going to talk to you today a little bit about understanding the impacts of changing cannabis policy. I'm an assistant professor up at Humboldt State University, and I'm also a senior researcher at the Center for Cannabis and Social Policy, and also a researcher at the only research institution in the state of California that studies cannabis, and that's the Humboldt Interdisciplinary Institute of Cannabis Research. Today I want to talk a little bit about changing cannabis legislation and try to help us understand some of what that means for the region and for Sonoma County. The title of my talk is Opportunities and Challenges, Prohibition and Post-Prohibition Era, and give you some lessons from the Emerald Triangle. I'm going to focus my comments on research into environmental issues related to cannabis agriculture in both the past, the present, and the future. So an outline of my talk is I'm going to talk a little bit about the impacts of past and present cannabis policy and the impact that policy has had on cannabis cultivators in the region up north in the Emerald Triangle. And I'm going to try to help us understand some of the political economic reasons that the industry took a particular path to understand what are those opportunities there for cannabis cultivators to engage in particular types of practices. And then I'm going to address how these issues were dealt with regionally and locally. And finally, I will end hopefully on a positive note and talk a little bit about MRSA and AMA, a couple pieces of legislation there that we're going to be shaping cannabis policy as we move forward. So that said, I want you to take a second and close your eyes if you could for me. And then take a deep breath. What's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of the word Humboldt? Right? Yes, exactly. Exactly. It's certainly not, you know, it's certainly not candy, right? The state may be the leading supplier of cannabis in the United States, California. We are actually California's the largest domestic supplier of cannabis. We beat out Mexico recently. But the Emerald Triangle, specifically Humboldt County, is the center of the universe of cannabis agriculture and cannabis culture. And it's been this way for decades. Even though many folks don't really want to recognize that. Some of the economics of marijuana agriculture, I mean, the farm value of cannabis has been estimated between 2.5 billion upwards to 5 billion annually, and that's in California alone. Nationwide, we're looking at $13 to $35 billion. It is the cash crop of California, and some would say the nation. Compare that, and this ties a little bit to what Ernie says, compare that to the war on drugs, about 50 million on the war on drugs, a failed war on drugs, as I want to note. In Humboldt County, marijuana alone contributes to around, again, these are estimates because we don't necessarily know the numbers, 400 million to around 1.5 billion. And this compares to what was the leading industry at the time, timber, which brings in around 40 million or 60 million. So that said, you know, when I arrived as a grad student in the mid-90s at Humboldt State, other than the occasional class survey of, you know, drug use, there was no social science research being done on this topic. HSU and I think most institutions had an aversion to cannabis research, wanted nothing to do with it. It was a taboo topic, and there was a stigma associated with doing research there. Even though many of us knew that it was the economic driver of the region, the cultural fabric, there was a code of silence. Even after Prop 215, few academics touched this, so we know very little about the industry, still today. At the time, I was actually involved at the front lines of the forest battles, trying to stop the timber industry from logging old growth, so I wasn't really necessarily interested in this topic, though I knew and was embedded in cannabis culture. And it wasn't until I finished up with my work up in Oregon, I returned to Humboldt in the late 90s, when I reconnected with the cannabis community there. And this is a post-Proposition 215 environment. And I started to notice the environmental impact of both indoor and outdoor agriculture and cannabis. So the agricultural practices of this industry started to resemble those practices of other industrial extractive industries. You had massive impacts, and I'll just show you a couple slides here. These are dots. These red dots are actually cannabis industrial farms, thousands of plants, and they litter the landscape. This is about 2012. So what we saw then in my research pursuits, we had massive habitat destruction, we had illegal timber harvesting. This is a before and after. And no one's living up there. This isn't a farm. This is, you know, to support, they're not growing apples up here, right? But you see here, you have unregulated industrial agriculture taking place in an area that's already in recovery of 100 years of resource abuse by timber, mining, and ag. And I want to say those were regulated industries. So what we found, what I found in my research was that, you know, there was no one really wanting to talk about this issue. The code of silence was there. So I started to shift my attention to studying this issue and trying to draw attention to the environmentally harmful practices and understand the reasons why these things are taking place. So I was the first sociologist to really put together a research agenda on this topic to address these issues. And, you know, we needed to talk about it. So what I started to do is arrange some forums. Another issue is, we'll talk about later some of the toxic pesticides, but I started to address this issue by arranging some forums where the community could come together and talk about what path forward we could take to deal with some of these environmental issues, to try to get the community to, and policymakers to have a dialogue about the ecological and human health of the industry. So we brought together academics, agency experts, growers, and try to understand that problem. And what it pointed to was prohibition, and how prohibition creates these sort of social, political, and economic conditions for bad actors to engage in harmful practices. It rewards people who do the most devastation. So those growers, what I found, are trying to do the right thing. Those were the folks that were rated, and those are the folks that were policed the most. The most environmentally friendly grows were the ones that were that got all the attention. So, you know, what is the grower's response when you get rated, when you're trying to come into compliance? Well, you know what? You're just going to go indoor. And the indoor issues are, the indoor is probably one of the worst ways to grow marijuana. I have some medical advocates saying we should do some indoor because it controls, but the indoor agriculture is really problematic. So I started to have symposiums and we started to break the code of silence. We had actually an Earth Day symposium on marijuana and the environment. It was on 4/20. It was 2 days of panels that brought together people who come from different sort of interests. We had policymakers, we had fed wildlife, we had law enforcement, we had growers and academics to talk a little bit about these. And this is 2012 and 2013. So we're trying to push this conversation forward because this is the lifeblood of our community in the North. As I showed earlier, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. So to address these, you know, I think the community started to recognize some things here. One was, as I said, it's the lifeblood. The other is that this industry is unlike any other industry, any other ag industry. Unlike big ag like wine and vegetables, where the workforce is paid slave wages and the working conditions suck, right? In this industry, workers are paid well and working conditions are excellent, right? So it's a different type of agriculture for cannabis agriculture in terms of working conditions and such. So these folks, industry folks, government folks, are trying to work together to try to protect the economy and to craft rules that actually protect both business and the environment. So that said, you know, to address these policy gaps, local folks started to put together campaigns to push policymakers to craft legislation. And I have a couple slides here. This is recent cannabis legislation. This is MRSA. This is the Medical Marijuana Regulation Safety Act. This was the first real change in cannabis policy in 20 years. And what it did is it established some protocols for addressing the environmental issues. It also addressed issues of pot doctors, if you will, which we can get into later, but more germane to the environmental issues. It really set out some rules around what are appropriate environmental standards for cannabis agriculture. That said, that also folds into a ballot initiative, which is going to be on the ballot in 2016 in November coming up, and that is the Adult Use of Marijuana Act. These two acts, MRSA and AMA, kind of go hand in hand, and they reflect the concerns for both sustainability, ecological sustainability, but also economic sustainability. There are some questions that remain in our community, and that is big ag, right? We want to keep our economy there. We want to keep our small businesses. How do we address this issue of large agriculture, corporate agriculture coming in and taking over everything? And we lose that sort of cannabis culture, that cannabis economy that is so important to us. The other is the taxing, and I think I'm just going to hit this and finish it up. You know, it's around 15% plus a 7% tax. You know, is the tax structure the right tax structure? Is it going to promote the black market and these environmentally harmful practices, or is it going to be a structure in which folks will come into compliance? Right? So I think I'll leave this here. One more comment is I think important to recognize that growers want to come into compliance. The growers that I interview and talk to, they want to do the right thing. They have to be treated differently than they are now. I mean, right now there's a stigma, still the pot stigma. You know, You know, you get somebody who owns a winery that walks in, they're treated different than a pot grower, and that's got to change on all those levels for them to feel like they're legitimate, to be treated legitimately. So the stigma's got to be removed in our agencies, and also we have to just own up to what it, you know, it's a huge part of our economy and culture, and we got to start talking about this. And I think Tawnie's going to talk a little bit more about this issue, and we'll have some questions and answers. Question and answer. Thanks.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Ernie. There's the setup for some good dialogue about what about today? What are we going to do about these things? Now we have a perspective on how we've gotten here and what some of our primary issues are. I want to first address one nuance that I think is really important for just general public to understand. There is a clear divide happening that we can see within the industry, and I'm hoping that people can see in the industry from that are looking into the bubble of what is cannabis operations. We've been seen as this one drug growing, harvesting, distributing entity, but there's really nuances within it, just like any other industry. So when Tony earlier was talking about, regulated operators and talking about, the compliant operators and these excellent workspaces that we have, our farm workers who are getting paid well and treated well, we're talking about a portion of our industry where people choose to do the right thing, even though they're not being rewarded, even though everything could be taken away from them the next day because the feds might show up or camp might show up. They still will go back to doing the right thing because that's who they are as a person, and that's what's driving right now this movement towards MMRSA, the Medical Marijuana Regulation Safety Act that was passed last year through the 3 bills, and that's what's driving us to have this conversation today. We have good actors who are trying to do the right thing and change this industry into a responsible part of our local economy, of our environment, of the sociology, of our community. And right now we need to support those operators in their attempt to make that change for our industry. We still have bad actors. We have people who come into this industry because it's the quick and easy way to make money, and they have terrible workplaces. There are people who are worked like down to the bone and then might not even get paid, might not even survive the experience of working out on these farms. That is happening right now. And this is what we're trying to change. And its prohibition has given them that place to hide because, like Tony was saying earlier, why are they rewarded? Why is the person who's doing the most damage being the most rewarded? Because of ROI. They are putting the least amount of money into creating the most destructive, cheapest way to grow the marijuana on a farm, and they take that money and they run. And they have the most profit. And the people who are committed to their communities are giving that money into their local school and nonprofits and paying living wages and exceeding living wages by 50 to 150%. How are we rewarding those good actors, and how are we supporting them and continuing to build a model? Touching on what Ernie was saying earlier, I think that there's a really beautiful perspective here that the marijuana industry, as an industry, there was an inception, and it was when Prop 215 came into play. Prop 215, the Compassionate Use Act. This came from the AIDS epidemic in San Francisco. This was the heart of the movement. This was to give medicine to AIDS patients who were dying and couldn't afford the expensive AIDS medication. From there, an entire industry has come into play. And now, everybody wants a piece of the marijuana industry. Everybody's got an angle on how they're going to participate and how they're going to get into this. I bet everybody in this room right now at least knows somebody who's interested in what's happening with the cannabis industry or has been approached by a family member or a friend about it. With all of that activity, let's not lose sight of the foundation of what this is. This is a medicine. And it has been a medicine and has been recognized by humans who have been consuming and feeling the connection to the plant and feeling the connection to themselves. Ultimately, it is that connection to self that this plant medicine offers, and we don't want to lose that. So we need to continue to make sure that we're providing in all of our great ideas of how we're going to capitalize on this new regulations and opportunities. How are we streaming this, a piece of this excess of funds that are coming in through our industry into good projects? How are we putting it back into our environment? How are we putting it back into public safety? How are we putting it back into our schools? How are we going to prevent youth, or how are we going to support youth intervention? How are we going to support Latino communities that have been affected by this agricultural product and exploitation? That is all of us working together. So forward 20 years to now we have regulations. Regulations is literally the birth of a new industry. So like the car manufacturing industry and the wine industry and the tech boom that happened, here's the birth of a new industry. For the first time, regulated marketplace, where we have investors and we have players from all sorts of fields getting involved in this, because now it's safe to get involved. People's doors are still being busted down. Farms are still being raided. And unfortunately, it's usually the low-hanging fruit. The people that you know are not going to have a gun, the people who are not paying off law enforcement or feds from coming to their house are the ones that take the biggest hit. Again, how do we help this industry take that first step? California is always the leader, in the United States for progressive thoughts and creating sustainable enterprise. We're about to burden this new industry, and we can again be a thought leader by having a new industry boom that is from the get-go sustainable, from the get-go engaging and making sure that we're really being contemplative on our effect on the rest of the economy around us. And so this is really a great place for us to have a dialogue about how we can participate together. So at Sonoma County Growers Alliance, we're constantly looking for, who are we going to work with next, and what are we going to do, and what next environmental program can we get involved with? And we just got our brochure translated into Spanish because we want to make sure that that community is not missing all the information and accidentally being the ones who get rated next because they don't speak enough English to understand what the rules are. We want to make sure that those who suffer from consumption and substance abuse have support programs that are appropriate, that are no longer based off of propaganda and media. The DARE program just removed cannabis from its list of substances. We have an opportunity to come into the schools and have a real conversation. When you tell a child that cannabis is as bad as heroin, they can just as easily say, so heroin's not as bad? It's as good as cannabis, because I smoke pot, so I guess heroin's not that bad. So we have to change the dialogues everywhere we go. And when we hear an issue, we have to say, what's the solution? And that's where we need more people to come to us with solutions like, I've got a great idea, or I'm concerned about this, and this is what I want to see happen. So this is where I want to take this conversation back to the three of us up here and jump into a couple pieces, and then really like to invite you guys to think about a couple questions that you might have or suggestions and ideas that we can run with from there. Next mic.
Should I comment or something?
Yeah, you want to comment?
Yeah, we didn't quite work this part out.
Now we're just free flowing.
If it works. We didn't quite work this part out. Something I neglected to say and really want to say is that we're lucky to have Assemblyman Woods and Senator McGuire, because they seem not to be afraid to take this on. I think most of the change that's happened with marijuana has happened at the ballot box, and one should not ever overlook that. It sort of gives the locals courage to deal with the issue.
And I'd like to address that as well. I think, we were talking before this about the OMA initiative. For those of you who don't know, that's the Adult Use Marijuana Act, and that is the initiative. There's also the MCLR initiative that both of these initiatives are trying to gather enough signatures just to make it onto the ballot for 2016. So you may have the opportunity to vote on whether or not California is going to legalize recreational use of marijuana. In our industry, this is something we've been really hoping for a really long time. We're really excited for the opportunity to kind of remove some of the barriers, because there's a place for medical, and those are for people who medically need it. And there's a place for recreational, and those are for people who want to just consume it, like they have martinis and glasses of wine and cigarettes and a beer at the end of the day. So by allowing recreational, we're allowing people to be able to go into a dispensary that has that with just showing that they're an adult. You just have to show your driver's license. And that recreational use will be heavily taxed. Hopefully, the laws will be created in a contemplative way, and that some of that money will be able to provide access to medicine that is well tested, that is consistent for the patients that need it. Because this isn't really, an issue about whether or not most cannabis users could afford taxes. There's also a consideration that some patients flat out can't afford the taxes and the extra costs. They can barely afford the medicine right now. So let's continue to use that Compassionate Use Act and provide for them. The OMA initiative is kind of taking a forefront, I think mostly because they can really come out with the marketing for it, and it's big on the table. There's a lot of considerations with that. 15% tax. 15% tax at a state level. The localities can match that tax level. That means that our industry could see up to 30% tax on year one of a brand new industry. In my mind, that's more like eating the golden goose than ensuring that it continues to thrive and support our community. We have an opportunity right now to support this industry and guide it and help it give back to our community and help raise that tax revenue for our schools, for our public transportation, for the potholes, for the public ways, for environmental protection. And we need to make sure that we're kind of helping that industry survive the first couple of years. So I think that the OMA, am I on time?
No, I said, never mind.
So OMA initiative is an initiative that we will be voting on, but it's really important to understand as well that there's a nuance in that initiative. And this is where it gets kind of tricky. Maybe you do want to see recreational happen, but at what cost? In the OMA initiative, there will be a new license type introduced, and that'll be license type 5. License type 5, in 5 years after it passes, will allow for an unlimited canopy size. Right now, MMRSA has a cap. The largest cultivation site that any one operator can have is 1 acre. In agricultural terms, a drop in the bucket. But if we were trying to invite big corporate ag into this new industry in California, how would we roll out that red carpet? How about unlimited canopy size? You can have 5,000 acres. You can have 500 acres.
Can I say something?
Yes.
Can I ask you to put, is my PowerPoint there? I just wanted to put up the slide with the ALMA information on there. And one of the things I think should be known is, Oregon and Washington, they have recreational, it's legalized recreational. In Washington State, that push came from what we consider to be the social justice folks, the NAACP, and other folks that saw the sort of cannabis laws as being racist and unjust. So how their law was written in Washington State is very different how we've written it here, or how the OMA people are writing it here. And go forward a little bit to the end. I think it's the last slide. So the social justice folks up there, they tax the hell out of it in Washington State. The initiative wasn't written in Washington to make money. It was to get people out of jail. How it's written now in California, we have the folks with interests strictly economic. So it's a very different type of initiative. With that said, also, as you point out here, the tax structure here is kind of problematic for some folks. Question.
23%. That it's at point of sale and through distribution.
Yeah, so as I've placed here, there's the tax structure here for ALMA. It's 15 plus a 7, and then a 9 1/4 on flower, and a 2 and a, I can't read them, I'm going blind,
2.7
on leaf. Right, so again, it's less than Oregon, but it's still a pretty high tax sort of structure. So the question for me as an environmental sociologist and for the growers is it going to be more profitable not to come into compliance and avoid this sort of tax here? So it's going to be a question, right? And I think 5 years we're going to revisit the tax structure. I think how this is written, this initiative, so it allows some flexibility. But again, right now this stuff is still a bit up in the air.
Yes, and I want to, Tawnie keeps me balanced because I look and say, oh my God, bad law, how can they do this again? But as she points out, as you're pointing out, we're at the beginning, so perhaps I can be patient for a few more years. But what Sonoma County does not know is the economic value of this crop. They estimate $1.4 billion for wine. I'm going to guess, as we said here, that the value of marijuana to this county is equal or better. But the county needs to do that study because those who understand economics will understand this better than social justice arguments. And lastly, that economic value, the bad laws and the overtaxing and regulations will keep this in the black market. You'll never bring those people out. Black market's not going away. The worse the government does, the more that market stays underground.
Yeah, I'm going to bring this into a little bit of soil biology here. And you think about when you have an anaerobic system, something that's, parasitical, and if you introduce enough probiotics or aerobic biotics into that system, it flourishes, it pushes out that parasitical environment. We can do that in this industry by supporting the good operators and feeding them and helping them like actually bloom into our communities. And by default, that will actually be forcing out the black market that has those illegal activities that we see in the newspapers. And it'll help us create clear guidelines for our law enforcement, because how are they supposed to know the difference when they're looking from a Google map or from the helicopter whether or not that person is actually a school teacher who is also volunteering on the weekends for an environmental group when they see 2 hoop houses in the backyard? They can't make those personal decisions, but when they go and knock on the front door and they see that there's a permit, they know that person has actually gone through the system and proven themselves, and that if they're not violating any other laws, then they're not going to have their door knocked down and their crop destroyed. And that's going to actually support more people making that change and making that shift and investing themselves into a better marketplace. And just to touch on that state tax, when Mike McGuire came out with a bill, SB 987, with 15% tax, and when he came out with that, there was a pushback from the whole cannabis community. People were outraged at 15% tax, even though Sonoma had already had it embedded for months, and it had been public knowledge that was there. And the issue was, don't tax medicine. Well, we need to define when it's medicine and when it's recreational. But are we ready to define that right now? Are we ready to, as an industry that's like fledgling coming in, who's never been regulated? Are we ready to actually make 2 industries at the same time in the same year, or do we want to support our local operators?
One last thing real quick is I just want to say that this industry itself is agreed to be regulated unlike any industry in the history of agriculture. So it's going to be the most regulated industry in ag that you can imagine, that you can come up with. So the point for me on this is, it's great. I would hope that this model is transferred to wine, to all food products, but probably won't be into the timber industry. So there is a bit of an unlevel playing field here in terms of how this industry is being treated versus other agricultural industries. And we're hoping that they actually come to our level, the cannabis industry level, with these pieces of legislation. Probably not with the political power of big ag, but that's a hope for the future.
And we also have right now a government that is willing to work with us. An initiative was necessary 20 years ago when our government would not talk to us, when they wouldn't talk about it, when it was still a silence, and there was this stigma around it. But right now, every time I go into the Capitol and I talk to one of our elected officials, they've got a notebook and they're taking notes as fast as they can. They are so interested in figuring out how to create the solutions. We have a government that is working with us on creating these solutions. We don't need to push an initiative that is unbendable. We need to actually continue to work with the government and continue to create bills and add-ons, because this industry is moving so fast. When Prop 215 was written, we didn't have apps on mobile phones. There was no way to even conceive of delivery sales happening on an app through the touch of a button. Like, how could we regulate that? We need to be able to change each year, because that's how fast our technology technology is moving. We need to be able to amend. There's an app for that. So, you know, we have this opportunity on local government side to create good regulations, and we have that opportunity on state level. And what we need is to be continuing to bring great minds to the tables from new perspectives. It is questions time. So I'll open it up.
Thank you. I had an opportunity to speak to Senator McGuire last week, and I asked him about that 15% tax, and it's on top of other taxes, et cetera, and it just seemed crazy. And the response from he and his staff was that the price would actually go down from what it is now, therefore it'd be more of a wash. I'm wondering what your opinion is on that, and also if you know historically from Colorado, Washington, Oregon.
Okay. The price will go down at whose cost? Who will be receiving less money when the price goes down? We're taking an industry that has been vertically integrated. The cultivator is also the person who's running the team that's trimming it or processing. They're also packaging or manufacturing. Then they are driving it to the dispensary, and the dispensary is selling it. So when that cultivator can no longer make that sequence, and the cultivator now has to contract somebody to manufacture, and contract somebody to transport, and contract a lab to charge $50 to $150 per test, per, you know, if we're lucky, batch and lot system of 100 square feet. If that cultivator then has to contract a distribution team to sell to that retailer, that's a lot of contracts, that's a lot of add-ons. So if the price is going down, it's at whose cost? Because there's a lot of people adding on to it right now. So I fear for the cultivators when I hear that. Anybody else?
There's two hands back there, I see, and one up here. Take your pick.
I don't think it's on.
We can hear
Volume.
you.
You hear me? Hello. Oh, yeah. Sorry. So this question's for Tony. Anybody else that wants to answer? But I'm an advocate of public banking, and that being a potential depository bank for the marijuana funds. We establish our own banks in our own towns, counties for that, and other reasons. But we've heard rumor down here in Sonoma County. I've heard it from a few people that up in Humboldt there's a group of folks that are working on establishing a bank as a depository for the marijuana funds. Do you know anything about that?
They are working on it. I don't know if they've been successful, but
And can you hook me up?
But in hello, can you hear me? I don't think they've been successful yet. In Alma, there is actually, and there's a bill that's been introduced recently to free up a little bit of the constraints on banking. And I forget, it's a Senate bill or Assembly bill, I forget.
AB
what it was.
1575.
Yeah, so
Bonta.
it's in the hopper now to actually allow for banks to accept money from the industry. But that's been a big struggle for...
The California Cannabis Credit Union is the concept that had been proposed, just to answer that a little bit more in depth as well. And we are in an election year. We don't know what type of president we're going to get and what kind of pushback. So as a state, I think there's a little bit more of a conservative pause that we're going to see in 2016, and then maybe bring that conversation back in 2017.
As a follow-up, can you just discuss how AB 1575 ties into the Federal Reserve, if at all?
Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah, that would be a problem.
Yeah, over my pay grade.
Hey, I just wanted to know which legislators or decision makers are championing these bills, and who's most excited about it in the California government?
We have Senator Mike McGuire, Assemblyman Jim Wood. We also have Assemblyman Bonta, Cooley, Lackey, thank you, and Joan Sawyer. I know Fiona Ma, who is the Board of Equalization district representative for us here, has been probably our strongest champion in talking about what do we do with an all-cash industry. The issues that we're seeing with the robberies and the theft and vandalism, it's because there's tens of thousands of dollars in cash sitting in somebody's house in a safe.
Yes, and yeah, don't forget the local level. You're in a city now that prohibits everything, which is somewhat ironic for having this conference. Santa Rosa, Sebastopol have enlightened attitudes, but locally here it's all over the place in terms of clinics and everything that goes with Prop 215. So pay attention locally as well, and don't forget to speak up when you think there's bad law.
I think it's worth pointing out that bans historically have never worked. That's the conversation about prohibition. That's the conversation about local level bans. When you tell a teenager you're not allowed to do anything, sit in your room, they're going to figure out how to sneak out, and then they're going to go do the things that you fear the most. But if you give them guidance and you give them boundaries and you give them support, they're much more likely to actually follow a good path. So yes, I think it is going to be really interesting to watch the next year of demographic research in the cities in Sonoma County and around the state that are creating good guidelines and regulations, and the cities that ban, and what the crime rates actually end up looking like.
Hi, Tony, if you could address this. I feel like there's an elephant in the room that we haven't discussed, especially sustainability being the broader topic here, and that's what if California sees continued years of drought? What happens to the outdoor farmer, considering that outdoor plants could consume up to 1 gallon of water per day, which is a lot of water when you're talking about a considerable farm?
When they limit water to grapes, they can limit water to marijuana, as far as I'm concerned. There
Could
are
I-
big
could I-
farms which are different, but in this county, you have people growing a few plants, and I don't see that the water issue is a big issue. It concerns us all, but I don't know, how do you pick and choose? I have 2 pet pigs. They drink 2 gallons of water a day. I don't know.
You can dry farm vines to some extent after a few years. Cannabis plants, you can't.
Well, you got the frost protection. I think it's pretty equal.
So, is this on? So, we have thousands, we got over 4,000, some are upwards to 5,000 outdoor, large-scale farms in Humboldt County. Many of them, and if you haven't got a chance, there's a Google video that I put out a few years back addressing some of these issues. The landscape in the rural communities is littered with small farms, and they're drawing from salmon-bearing creeks and streams. It's sometimes dewatering streams that we've been working on to rehab for years. So, there is an impact, and there's a cumulative impact that this industry has. We have to recognize it and devise strategies to protect fish and the industry itself. Right now, because of prohibition, people are just, black market, right? And those that do want to go into compliance, and a great example is recently up in Humboldt County where someone had a huge bladder, they stored water, and the feds came and raided them, right? They were doing the right thing. But the feds came and said, you're doing the wrong thing, and see this big bladder, look at these grows, right? But they were storing water. So I think there's ways that we can do it. We have to develop best management practices. And we can't talk about that because it's federally prohibited. At one point in Humboldt State, I do these conferences, I was banned from actually talking about best management practices because that's advocacy. Right? So we can't, we're still dealing with these issues. Regulators can't help cannabis agriculture. Cannabis agriculture is because of the federal prohibition. So until we develop best management practices, we're going to continue to have this problem, right? And with the drought, it accelerates this. So.
I want to just say, I think it's worth pointing out that when that bladder was discovered and pointed out, not only did they treat them like a bad actor, though they were storing water, they slashed it. Thousands of gallons, not only slashed, that was potential fire prevention in that entire valley, but then the topsoil that went into the creeks. There was an environmental investigation to sue whoever was responsible for that. I don't know what the outcome of what.
And these are examples of, again, the feds targeting people that want to come into compliance. Sure, they got thousands of plants. Everybody's got thousands of plants out there, but they're trying to do it the right way, right? And again, what happens when you bust someone with thousands of plants? How do they make up that money? They go indoor. We don't want that indoor, and that's exactly what they do. They go indoor, and then big diesel generators. And I have a fear that with more of this sort of hyper-vigilant quasi-prohibition that people are just going to start building shacks and diesel doping again. And we don't want that. So, I mean, to your question is best management practices.
Oh, sorry. I just want to clarify one thing. It's not the growing of the wine. It's the producing of the wine itself, the washing of the bottles, the whole assembly line thing. So when you get down to that and you start adding the new marketing event centers where hundreds of people come and they have to use the bathroom and drink the water and you cook the food, I'm saying wine uses more water than marijuana. So just don't pick on this crop, even though we're all against big illegal grows on national forest and keeping people out. That's totally wrong, or taking it out of the stream. Sorry, just wanted clarity.
Quick question here. Do the ALMA laws have any provisions for growing hemp?
So hemp is going to be an interesting dialogue where we have to integrate, and we have to integrate, again, intentionally. It has a very, cannabis has a large pollination zone, I think up to 10 miles when the wind blows. That could destroy an entire cannabis economy. We have to put them in the right place. Hemp is a wonderful plant that we need to work with, and the regulations need to be done well. Lots of hands.
Hi, I just wanted to offer a quick correction. I'm a food farmer, and so Tony, I wanted to let you know that actually food farming is highly regulated, down to sort of when you sell apples, how many can be in a box if you sell it to a grocery store. So please don't wish any more regulation on us. But I had a question about kind of what the landscape has looked like post-legalization in different states. I had heard that the price had dropped, 50% after Colorado legalized, which forced a lot of small growers out of business. Is that a trend in other states, and what can we kind of expect if we do have legalization in terms of supply and demand in Sonoma County and in California?
So I'll speak to a couple and then maybe have a Tawnie talk. I keep getting confused which one I'm going to here.
Double mic it.
One of the things that we find in these states that have gone legal is they're getting their weed from California. It's from us. We're shipping it there, right? So they can't deal with the supply. Colorado, Washington, thousands and thousands of kilos are going all over, coming from here. The other thing is, because no one really addressed this issue, these environmental issues and the toxic issue, much of what goes into these areas now is toxic weed, right? It's nasty stuff. It doesn't cut their testing. So, the price certainly has dropped, right? But not to the point where it's not profitable for people to continually ship it out and grow it here. So I don't know how you can add to that.
Okay, so California is a major agricultural state. Cannabis is competing to be one of the biggest agricultural products in California. We do not have that many people smoking pot in California. So we probably are a bigger export state than anybody's really ready to recognize. And when MMRSA comes into effect in 2018 and a licensed or permitted cultivator can only sell to a distributor who can only sell to a retailer, those retail outlets will be the only way that millions of pounds of marijuana can be sold a year. And when the black market continues to try to push it out by land, sea, and air, and are shut down at the borders, there is going to be a completely new shift in our cannabis industry that not even the cannabis operators can conceive of what that impact is going to look like. There is an old history here where there are amazing cultivators coming out of primarily Humboldt and Mendocino and the Emerald Triangle, and there's a time where a lot of exportation has been happening over the years, and there are the kind of headhunters, if you will, from Florida and New York and Michigan and Chicago, coming in looking for the best of the best of the best, the caviar of the industry. And when they find it, it never even hits the California market, it goes straight out. But if we shut down those borders, we're going to see a completely different shift. So there's no way to predict what our market's going to look like when those producers can no longer export, nor is there a way to predict what's going to happen when our small farmers for the first time can proudly say, I'm a cannabis operator. I send my kids to Waldorf school based on my beautiful framed, forever flowering greenhouse. Like we don't know what this is going to look like. This is a big, giant experiment. But what we can do is set it up to make sure that we set the regulations in place and we protect our local economy. The only way we're going to protect our local economy is by protecting our local operators. So you have to engage and we have to have that conversation.
I have a friend who went to Amsterdam to find some seeds, and he went over there and he found these seeds, and he came back, I don't know what the name of it was, and he was talking to some of the local surfers, and they said, well, we developed those right here in Sonoma County.
I think we have hit our time. Thank you all so much for your thoughts and your questions and your attention today on this subject, and we really look forward to speaking with you offline.